Welcome to another deep dive. Today, we're going on a journey.
Ooh, where are we headed?
We're going to try to understand the Baloch people.
Sounds fascinating.
It is. We're diving into their history and culture and really getting into their struggle for self-determination.
A very timely topic for sure.
Definitely. And we've got some great material to help us. We're using excerpts from a book called The Baloch and Balochistan, a historical account from the beginning to the fall of the Baloch state.
That sounds like it covers a lot of ground.
Oh, it does. And it raises some big questions about identity, power, and what it means to have the right to self-determination.
Those are huge issues,
Yeah.
especially in today's world.
Right. And just think, this story goes back thousands of years, like way back.
How far back are we talking?
This book traces their roots back 3,000 years to the Aryan migrations.
Wow, so they were on the move for a long time.
Yeah, their journey seems to have started somewhere in Central Asia.
Near the Caspian Sea, I'm guessing.
Exactly. And eventually they ended up in what we now call Balochistan.
It's amazing how they carried their language and traditions across all those miles and through all those years.
It really is. And their language, Balochi, has become a powerful symbol for
That's
you.
a link to their past.
Yeah, and it unites them even today. It connects them to their roots and to each other.
It's part of the Indo-Iranian language family, right?
It is. And, the book also digs into their history of resistance.
Resistance against who?
Well, way back, they were dealing with the Persian Empire.
And I bet they didn't just sit back and take it.
Not at all. There's this really cool quote from the Shahnameh.
Oh yeah, the epic Persian poem.
That's the one. And it describes the Baloch battling the Persians.
I can't wait to hear this.
Well, it's not just about some fight they had. The poem paints them as these incredible warriors, skilled archers, and fierce defenders of their land.
So they had a reputation even back then.
Yeah, even way back then, they were seen as a force to be reckoned with.
Like they weren't going to back down from anyone.
Exactly. They had this long-standing reputation for independence and for standing up to big empires.
That's a pretty powerful image.
It really is, and it sets the stage for understanding where they are today.
Yeah, their fight for self-determination isn't something new.
Right, it's deeply rooted in their history. They've been pushing back against bigger powers for centuries.
It's like a pattern that keeps repeating.
It really is. And speaking of their fight, let's talk about Balochistan itself.
The land and the people.
Yeah, and how it got divided. The book describes this huge region.
Stretching all the way from southeastern Iran to the Indus River.
You got it. But it's a region that's been cut up by political borders.
And I bet those divisions have really impacted the Baloch people.
Oh, absolutely. Imagine a place where the people and their culture have been connected for centuries.
And then suddenly it's split apart by outside forces.
That's exactly what happened in the 18th and 19th centuries.
British and Russian interests were at play, I assume.
Right on the money. And they basically carved up the region.
I've heard of those lines on the map. The Goldsmith line, the Durand line, the McMahon line.
Yeah, those lines weren't just on paper.
They actually divided communities and tore people apart.
I know. It's hard to even imagine what it was like to live through that.
To have your whole world turned upside down by some line on a map.
And it wasn't just families getting split up.
Trade routes were probably disrupted too.
Yeah, and traditional grazing lands were cut in half. It was a mess.
And those lines are still causing trouble today.
They sure are. They fuel tensions and make it harder for the Baloch to come together as one people.
To assert their identity and their right to decide their own future.
It's like those lines are holding them back.
And it's not just outside forces they have to deal with. The book talks about their relationship with Islam.
It's interesting, right? They're mostly Muslim, but they've always had a unique approach to religion.
So it's not just about following a strict set of rules.
It's more than that. They don't see religion as the main thing when it comes to governing themselves.
Their own traditions and culture come first.
Exactly. And they haven't been happy with attempts to impose a rigid religious system on them.
That makes sense. They value their own ways of doing things.
And that clashes with how some states, like Pakistan, use Islam.
Pakistan's used it as a political tool.
Yeah, and that's caused a lot of tension between them and the Baloch.
The Baloch feel like their culture is being pushed aside.
So we've got this history of resistance, a divided land, and different views on religion.
And all that leads to the conflicts we see today.
Exactly. To understand what's happening now, we need to look at their struggles with Iran and Pakistan.
Both countries have been accused of some pretty terrible things.
Human rights abuses, oppression, trying to crush the Baloch desire for freedom.
It's a dark side of the story.
It is. And the book gives some disturbing examples, like the Dad Shah episode in Iran.
What happened there?
It started as a personal feud, but it became a symbol of resistance.
So it was about more than just one incident.
Way more. It tapped into this deep resentment and desire for change.
And then there's the Balochistan conflict in Pakistan.
The book describes it as a brutal struggle that's gone on for decades.
It all really kicked off in 1948 when Pakistan annexed Balochistan.
And the Baloch had just declared independence. Talk about adding fuel to the fire.
That annexation really solidified the resistance movement.
And Pakistan's response has been, well, harsh.
Military operations, cracking down on dissent, and accusations of serious human rights violations.
A pretty bleak picture.
It is.
Yeah.
And then there's this phrase the book uses, kill and dump.
Chilling, right.
It refers to what Pakistani security forces are accused of doing. They allegedly abduct Baloch activists or suspected insurgents,
And then their bodies turn up later.
often with signs of torture, dumped in remote areas.
It's horrifying to think about.
It creates a climate of fear. People are terrified.
And it just fuels the anger and resentment.
The assassination of Nawab Akbar Bugti in 2006 didn't help either,
He was a prominent Baloch leader.
and a vocal critic of the Pakistani government.
His death sparked huge protests.
It became a symbol of the brutality they faced.
It's clear the Baloch have been through a lot in their fight for self-determination. But what does that actually mean for them?
That's a great question. What are they fighting for?
It's not just about political autonomy, is it?
It's much deeper than that. They want control over their land and their resources.
They want to be masters of their own fate.
And they want to preserve their culture, their language, their way of life.
So it's a fight for their very existence as a people.
Exactly. They argue that Iran and Pakistan are occupying powers.
That they have no right to be there.
And they're basing their struggle on international law and basic human rights.
But they've been pretty much on their own in this fight.
The book talks about how little international support they've gotten.
Why is that? Why has the world ignored them?
It's complicated. During the Cold War, the West saw them through the lens of the Soviet Union.
They were afraid of upsetting the balance of power.
They thought supporting Baloch independence would help the Soviets.
So the Baloch got caught in the middle again.
And what about Russia? Have they done anything?
Not really. They've been pretty quiet, probably because they want things to stay stable in Iran and Pakistan. It's sad to see how politics often trumps human rights.
It really is.
But has anything changed since the Cold War ended?
There have been some shifts, but not big ones,
The West is starting to rethink its relationships with Iran and Pakistan.
especially with worries about nuclear weapons and human rights abuses.
And then you've got China getting more involved.
Their investments in Balochistan are adding a whole new layer of complexity.
So the Baloch struggle is tangled up in this global power play now. It's a lot to untangle, and it makes you wonder, what does the future hold for them?
Yeah, it really does feel like a crossroads for them.
And it's tricky, we've got to try to understand how these things we've talked about.
Like the lack of support and the Cold War stuff, now China getting involved.
Yeah, how it all ties together and affects their fight for self-determination.
But what about the Baloch people themselves? I mean, are they all on the same page? That's a good question, and the book talks about that too. Actually, there are some divisions within the Baloch nationalist movement.
Makes sense, right. You've got all these different groups with their own histories,
Exactly.
different perspectives, different ways of thinking about things.
So how do those differences play out, you think?
Well, I'm guessing it can't be easy to present a united front when you've got different groups pulling in different directions.
You're right about that. Some groups want complete independence.
From both Iran and Pakistan.
Yeah, while others are okay with some kind of autonomy.
Like maybe a federal arrangement where they have more control but are still part of the bigger country.
Right. And then you have some who believe in armed struggle,
Fighting for what they want.
while others prefer peaceful protests and working through the political system
So it's almost like they're fighting on two fronts.
against outside forces and amongst themselves.
Does the book say anything about how those divisions affect their chances of success?
It does. It says that being divided makes it harder to stand up to powerful countries like Iran and Pakistan.
Because they can't put up a united front?
It weakens their position and makes them easier to manipulate.
Divide and conquer.
Exactly.
I
It's
mean-
an old tactic, but it still works.
But even with all these challenges, the Baloch have shown some serious resilience.
No doubt about it.
What do you think keeps them going when the odds are stacked against them like this?
Well, they have this incredible connection to their land and culture,
Like it's part of who they are.
deep down,
Yeah.
and that fuels their resistance. They've shown they're willing to sacrifice a lot.
To endure real hardship to reach their goals.
It's inspiring, really. when you think about what they're up against.
It's incredible. And we've talked about the brutal tactics used against them.
Kill and dump policy, the disappearances, the
Yeah.
military
How
operation.
do they keep resisting in the face of all that fear and oppression?
It takes a special kind of courage. You have to remember, they're going up against states with huge resources.
And a willingness to use violence to stay in control.
But the Baloch have found ways to adapt.
To keep fighting even when it seems impossible.
What are some of the ways their investments could bring some economic benefits?
But at what cost?
There are worries about environmental damage, exploitation of resources.
And even more control over the Baloch people's lives.
So many factors to consider.
So much at stake.
At the end of the day, the Baloch people will have to decide how to move forward.
To navigate this complex situation and chart their own course.
Which brings us back to the big question. What does the future hold for them?
With their history, the divisions, the geopolitics, and their sheer determination.
What are the possible scenarios that could play out?
I'm really interested to hear your thoughts on this.
Well, let's start with the most optimistic outcome.
What would that look like?
Imagine if Iran and Pakistan actually came to the negotiating table in good faith.
And recognize the Baloch people's right to self-determination.
A peaceful resolution to the conflict.
That would be amazing. But it would require a huge change in attitude from both countries.
They'd have to stop seeing this as a win-or-lose situation.
And start thinking about a solution that works for everyone.
Exactly. They'd need to be willing to compromise.
To address the historical wrongs and the current injustices.
So what would that kind of settlement look like?
Would it mean full independence for Balochistan?
Maybe. Or it could involve a significant level of autonomy within the existing states.
A federal system where they have more control over their own affairs?
It all depends on how much each side is willing to give.
To find a solution that meets the Baloch people's core demands while respecting the borders that are already there.
It's a tough balancing act.
But it's not impossible.
Not at all. But it would take a lot of work.
What would it take to get everyone to the table and create a lasting peace?
Well, it would need pressure from both inside and outside Iran and Pakistan.
People speaking out, demanding change.
International mediators could help too.
And maybe some economic incentives to sweeten the deal.
And what about the Baloch people themselves?
They'd have to be a big part of this process, wouldn't they?
Absolutely. They'd need to overcome their internal divisions.
To come together and speak with one voice.
And be clear about what they want.
To engage in real dialogue with Iran and Pakistan.
It's a big ask, but it's the best case scenario.
A peaceful resolution to the conflict would benefit everyone.
Not just the Baloch people, but the entire region.
It would bring stability to a place that's seen so much violence.
It would be a victory for human rights, for self-determination.
A sign that peaceful coexistence is actually possible.
But we can't ignore the possibility that things might not go so well.
What if they can't reach an agreement? What are the alternatives?
One possibility is that things just keep going the way they are.
The status quo.
Low-level conflict with occasional flare-ups of violence and repression.
So more suffering for the Baloch people with no end in sight.
And there's always the risk of things escalating.
Could this conflict spiral out of control and turn into a bigger war?
It's definitely a risk.
Yeah.
Especially if other countries get involved.
The book mentions extremist groups operating in the region.
They could exploit the instability and make things even worse.
And what about a humanitarian crisis?
We can't rule that out either. If the violence gets out of hand, it could displace huge numbers of people.
Lead to famine and widespread suffering.
It's a grim thought, but we have to consider it.
It shows how high the stakes are.
And how urgent it is to find a peaceful solution.
The Balochistan conflict isn't just a local problem.
It has implications for the whole world.
It raises questions about self-determination, human rights, and the responsibility of the international community.
To protect people who are vulnerable.
So we're left with a mix of hope and a sense of urgency.
Hope that a peaceful resolution is possible, and a need to act now before things get even worse.
To create a better future for the Baloch people, yeah, it is a lot to process, but it's helpful to see the whole picture. It really drives home how much is on the line for the Baloch people.
Exactly, and it's important to remember that this conflict is still unfolding. There are so many possibilities for how things could play out.
And those possibilities are influenced by so many different factors, right? Like we've been talking about, you have the internal dynamics within the Baloch movement itself. Right.
Then you have what Iran and Pakistan are doing, and then you have these outside players like China, the West, and Russia all getting involved.
Yeah.
It's a lot to keep straight.
It is. It's like a puzzle with all these moving pieces. And to really understand it, we need to look closer at some of those key players.
So where should we start?
Well, let's start with the Baloch people themselves. What are they really after? And what are they doing to achieve their goals?
Okay, so at the core of their struggle is this desire for self-determination.
Right, that's the driving force.
They want to control their own destiny, their own resources, their own culture.
And we've talked about how that desire has led to different forms of resistance.
Peaceful protests, political activism, and in some cases, armed struggle.
Right, there's a whole spectrum of approaches.
And all these different groups and organizations have emerged within the Baloch movement.
Like the Balochistan Liberation Army, or BLA.
They're the ones who want complete independence from Pakistan, right?
Right.
Yeah, they've taken up arms against Pakistani security forces. And they've been labeled a terrorist organization by Pakistan, the UK, and the US.
Wow. And are there groups that are more open to working things out within the existing countries?
There are. The Balochistan National Party, or BNP, is one example.
They're more about getting more autonomy for Balochistan within Pakistan.
Yeah, they've tried to work within the system, participating in elections and things like that.
So you have these different groups with different goals and strategies. Does that create problems for the movement as a whole?
It definitely can. It can make it hard to present a united front, especially when it comes to negotiating or getting support from other countries.
And it probably makes them easier to manipulate, right?
Exactly. Outside forces can take advantage of those divisions and play one group against another.
So it's like they're fighting on two fronts,
Mhm.
against their oppressors and against themselves.
In a way, yeah. It's a tough situation.
Okay, so we've talked about the Baloch people. Now, what about Iran and Pakistan? How do they view this whole thing, and what are they doing about it?
Well, for both of them, Balochistan is a strategically important region.
I can see why. It's got all those natural resources.
Right, and it's crucial for their territorial integrity. They don't want to see it break away.
So they haven't been too open to giving the Baloch any real autonomy.
Nope. They're afraid that could lead to more separatist movements and create instability.
And their response has often been pretty brutal, hasn't it?
Yeah, we've talked about the kill and dump policy in Pakistan, the disappearances, the military crackdowns.
It seems like they're more focused on silencing the Baloch than actually addressing their concerns.
It's a common pattern, unfortunately. Repression and co-optation.
Yeah.
Try to crush the opposition and buy off those you can.
But that hasn't really worked, has it?
Not in the long run. It just creates more resentment and pushes people towards more extreme groups.
It's a vicious cycle.
Exactly. Violence breeds violence.
Okay, so we've got the Baloch, we've got Iran and Pakistan. Now let's talk about those other players. China, the West, and Russia. How do they fit into all of this?
Well, China's really stepped up their involvement in Balochistan, especially on the Pakistani side.
Their Belt and Road Initiative, right.
Right. They're pouring money into infrastructure projects like the Gwadar port. They see it as a key strategic asset.
It sounds like it could be a big economic boost for the region.
It could, but there's some potential downsides too.
Like what?
Well, there are concerns about environmental damage and exploitation of resources. And some people worry that the influx of Chinese workers will displace local communities.
And then there's the whole question of China's political influence.
Right. Will all this economic investment give them more control over the Baloch people and their land? It's a big question mark.
So it's a complicated situation. Potential benefits, but also potential risks.
Definitely.
Okay, what about the West? What are their interests in Balochistan, and have they done anything to help the Baloch people?
Well, historically, the West, especially the U.S., has viewed the Balochistan conflict through the lens of its own strategic interests.
So during the Cold War, it was all about containing the Soviet Union.
Right. And that often meant turning a blind eye to human rights abuses.
And what about now? Has anything changed?
There's been more talk about human rights and democracy, but those concerns often take a back seat to other priorities.
Like counterterrorism and stopping the spread of nuclear weapons.
Exactly.
So the Baloch struggle is kind of stuck in this geopolitical limbo.
Yeah, it's often seen as a secondary issue, something that's less important than other global concerns.
And what about Russia? Where do they stand on all of this?
They've mostly stayed out of it. They don't want to do anything that could destabilize the region or upset Iran and Pakistan.
So the Baloch are caught in the middle of all these competing interests.
Yeah, and their voices often get drowned out by the noise of those bigger geopolitical games.
It's pretty disheartening.
It is. But it also highlights why it's so important to talk about these things, to raise awareness and try to understand what's really going on.
Because the Balochistan conflict isn't just some faraway problem.
Right, it's a human story. A story about people fighting for their dignity, their freedom, their right to exist. And those are things that should matter to everyone, no matter where they live.
It's a reminder that peace and justice aren't just abstract ideas. They're about real people's lives. And sometimes we have to dig a little deeper to see that.
That's the power of a deep dive, right? It helps us connect with those human stories, even when they seem far away.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of the Baloch people, I think the takeaway is this. Their struggle, though often ignored, is a reflection of this universal longing for freedom and self-determination.
Absolutely. And their story deserves to be heard.
It deserves our attention, our empathy, and our action. We have a responsibility to learn about these issues and to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult.
I couldn't agree more. The world needs more people who are willing to engage with these complex issues, to seek out those stories that are hidden in the shadows.
Because in the end, we're all connected. And the fight for justice and freedom, no matter where it happens, is a fight for all of us.
Well said. Let's keep learning, keep exploring, and keep fighting for a better world for everyone.